comments, a follow-up to Fred about ordo-liberalism. It's sort of something that I don't know if we should call it the elephant in the room. It's not quite an elephant because people have talked about it throughout the workshop. But you know, it reminds me these pieces of legislation that give a code of conduct with sort of per se violations resemble what we had in Israel with the food law, where we saw that the violations are so intense and so complicated, and the cases are so long that a rule of reason, traditional antitrust analysis doesn't really work. So we came up with legislation with a code of conduct with sort of per se prohibitions. So, you know, the question is, are we moving toward that? This is something that Fred was talking about, but it wasn't really clear to me what everybody thinks about it. I have the feeling that, you know, Herb was sort of against it. Eleanor in her papers mentions that Section 5 of the FTC Act could be a tool that enables that if the antitrust authorities only wanted. So I wondered what the panel thinks about that. Anybody?
If I can intervene briefly, in a sense, it is not a question of principle. It's more a pragmatic question. What is the best way to do this? So I don't know that a code of conduct, I mean, the DMA move in the direction of code of conduct, which it has a great advantage. Not the DMA, I'm sorry, the CMA. Has a great advantage over the DMA, which is first that it can be based on a market analysis. So therefore, it is not an across the board injunction on platforms that have very different business models. And second, it's a code of conduct. And I think that in the spirit of what Bill was saying, one has to see whether this is a good way to solve the problems. Time will tell. I'm personally more tempted by this solution than the EU solution, which seems to be more rigid and less mindful of adapting the commitments or the obligations to the circumstance. But second point I wanted to say, which has to do with the previous discussion, we did, as Michal Gal, I think, mentioned last week or 2 weeks ago at OECD, we had a discussion on interoperability and data portability. First, in the spirit of what Bill was saying, we did it with the regulators, with the data regulators, people who have experience in both interoperability and also some sectoral regulators. Second, when it comes to the conclusion, I'm not quite as optimistic as what Michal was saying. The basic answer was there is no silver bullet. Data portability doesn't work unless consumers react in a rational way. They don't react in a rational way to data, so because they have all kinds of biases, so it may not do the trick. And there may be examples, for example, in the UK, where data portability has not brought the kind of competition that one would hope for. Interoperability, same thing. You have to define a standard for interoperability. Question is, what is the implication of the standard that you define on innovation, on the rest of competition? It's very difficult. One has to study more. One has to study with the competent people, but rushing into a solution maybe, I mean, maybe as a small experiment, but on the idea of Eleanor Fox on gatekeeper, could we all agree on the definition of what gatekeepers are? I wish we could, and I wish that the objective were clear, whether gatekeepers in our mind are people who have a privileged access to data, which is an essential facility for anybody else who wants to get into a market, or are we talking about very big tech firms that make so much money that it's indecent and we want to get even at them? And there, when you look at the DMA, the European proposal, you have quantitative threshold that define what a gatekeeper is. Well, what that means is that neither one of the automobile manufacturers will meet those threshold, and each one of them, for the connected cars that they produce, is a gatekeeper, and they can block insurance company, repair services, even the big platform from getting access to the car. So they are gatekeepers. So that kind of definition doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Finally, and I promise to stop there, one of the problems, which is the elephant in the room when it comes to cooperation among competition authorities, is the fact that competition authorities have too much of a competition culture. Each one of them wants to be the first one to do this or to do that. So they are not willing to cooperate with them, with others, or to wait with others to bring, similar case at similar time. So I think that this mindset has to change and will change, because that is, I think, one of the only way to try to match the power of the big digital ecosystems.
Thanks, Fred.
May I jump in? And that was always beautiful remarks, Fred. And I just wanted to say something very specific about your question, David, about code of conduct. There's actually a continuum between common law adjudication and what our formulation is, what our standards are in the common law adjudication, and morphing into code of conduct. In the United States, if we had some aspects of the law we had many years ago, all of these practices that are put up now as being anti-competitive would be presumptively illegal. And the burden would shift for the justification, and we'd be able to do the work by our open competition law, common law system. And when I am thinking of a very modest code of conduct, it's really abstracting from the kind of rules we would have had if in the United States we had a more serious look at what was abusive and not justified. So that, yeah, common law systems maybe should be able to do it. Our own Justice Stephen Breyer, and on his opinions, if you follow them, would do this kind of thing where he said he would retain the per se rule against resale price maintenance, but it's clear that he would allow the justification. It's that kind of thing that we've lost in the United States. If it could be reinstituted in US, and if it were the case all over the world, I think we would not need the regulation.
Thanks, Eleanor. Bill?
A fascinating development to see in the US is the extent to which the FTC, with its new leadership, takes on these issues and what they define to be their priorities. There has been a strong suggestion that competition rulemaking will be the device to set out new standards of conduct. There's a commitment to go after more big firms. There is going to be a commitment to police mergers of all types much more aggressively at the margin. And there's going to be all of this existing business, like the Facebook case, which, goodness, I saw an American academic at the time it was issued called a slam dunk. I don't know what kind of basketball that commentator plays, but I sense it was a basket with a rim that's about 5 feet high. There are no slam dunks in American antitrust law litigating a case like that. It's got very demanding matters already. So if you're the chair of the agency and you've got this job, and by the way, you didn't think a week ago you were going to be doing this, and you say, here, go, what do you do first? How do you mobilize your program? What are your priorities to go about this? But I think what is unmistakable, David, and it's related to the observations that both Fred and Eleanor made about the development of a consensus, a perspective about what to do. The FTC is going to use that platform. The chair will use the platform to say, we want to restore the egalitarian vision of antitrust law that prevailed in the courts, certainly from roughly 1940 through the early 1970s. That's the right vision. We are not radicals, we are conservatives. That is what the foundations were. We want to restore them in the way that architects and artists would restore an old building that's fallen into disarray. We are restorationists. We're going to bring it back. And what fascinates me is in the larger discussion with the rest of the world, will we basically say the US, beginning soon, go on an apology tour that says what we did in the last 40 years was a distraction and we're sorry for it. And we want to join a mainstream of discussion elsewhere that says we are now part of the larger egalitarian vision. We are back. We are glad to be there. And we apologize for the emphasis that we applied on exactly the top of that bell curve that Herb mentioned before. This was a mistake and we give up on this. Now, courts, I just saw a note from Mikhail Halperin. Are the courts going to say, oh yes, not a damn bit? And when you look at the discussion that Herb was describing, that is very consciously an effort, if even indirectly, to tell the rest of the world, we don't believe any of that stuff right now. It is a plaintiff's victory in exceedingly conservative tones in the authorities they pick. The Supreme Court doesn't believe it a damn bit, which means if you're ultimately going to get the policy change, it's going to have to come through the legislature.